I got some information several months ago that actually had to do with this particular lesson, and I thought that's just an interesting way to start this lesson off. Any of you older ones remember any of these advertisements? This is an advertisement for a food processor from Kenwood, and it says the chef does everything to cook, and that's what the wives are for. Kind of a limited and narrow view of the role of women. Now, there was just 2 weeks ago an article in Time magazine on the sheconomy about the power of women and the spending power that women have in our economy, and not just the spending power, but the earning power. In October of last year, in the United States, women composed slightly over 50% of the workforce. How about this one from Del Monte Ketchup? I guess this was a new lid that they'd come out with. Even a woman can open it. How about that? I'm sure those bottles just flew off the shelves. To contrast that with this, today, in 2010, for every 2 males that graduate from college, there are 3 women that graduate from college. And that percentage has been growing over the last decade and a half, maybe 2 decades or so. And then this one from Kellogg's Pep Vitamins. Now, you may not be able to see that, read that section in the lower right-hand corner, but the husband comes home and he says, "Husband, you seem to thrive on cooking and cleaning and dusting, and I'm all tuckered out by closing time. What's the answer?" And she says, "It's vitamins, darling." That's how women can accomplish so much. And then up there at the top, of course, he said, "The harder a wife works, the cuter she looks." Husbands, try it on your wife and see if you get more work out of her. Well, wives, maybe you can try it on your husband and see if you can get more work out of him. The harder he works, the more handsome he looks. Well, women control 51.3% of the private wealth in the United States. Now, I don't know at what point men decided that they were smarter, harder working, more intelligent or whatever than women, but we went through, mankind that is, went through a period of time where that was indeed the case. And it seems like we've been playing catch-up now the last several years, trying to put women back in the place where they belong and where God intended them to be. And so the lesson this morning is on the feminine side of the church, the role that women play in the church. And we'll take a step back in time and look at the role that women have played in God's plan down through the years, of course, beginning with Adam and Eve. One man one time asked Mark Twain, he said, "Where would men be if there were no women in the world?" And Mark Twain said, "We'd be scarce, mighty scarce." So, women have played a role in God's plan from day one. You've heard this mentioned in wedding ceremonies, probably. God took the bone from Adam's side because the woman was to be a helper suitable. That's what the Hebrew word means, a helper comparable to man, his equal. Not from his head, lest he think that he could rule over her or dominate over her, nor from his foot, or she could dominate over him, nor from his foot, lest he think that he could trample over her, but from his side. Because God brought the woman to the man, and he designed her to be his equal, his complement, his counterpart. And so we look down through history and we see where God has used women quite often. Now, a woman was teaching her class one time about palindromes. That's one of those words or phrases that reads the same way backwards and forwards. And she asked her class what palindrome might Adam have said to Eve. And she was thinking that somebody would come up with, "Madam, I'm Adam." But one student spoke up and said, "Wow." That's what Adam said when he saw Eve. "This is now bone of my bones." Wow. You see, the first thing God did when he created Adam and Eve, or he created Adam rather, before he created Eve, the first thing God did when he saw that Adam was alone, and he said that's not good, was that he caused all the animals in the world to pass in front of Adam. That's the first thing God did. And Adam named all these animals, but the text says that Adam saw that there was not a helper suitable for him. So when he looked at the dog, and Americans say a dog's man's best friend, Adam said, "No, he's not. That's not a helper suitable for me." And so that's when God put a deep sleep over Adam. And when Adam woke up and he saw Eve for the first time, he said, "Wow, She is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She is my equal. She is my counterpart. And we move on down through history. Think about some of the women that God used in the Old Testament. Think about Noah's wife. If we are correct that Noah preached for 600 years before he had, or 120 years rather, before he had any, before the flood came, he preached for 120 years building the ark. What about Noah's wife? With all those people that were mocking Noah and criticizing Noah, saying, well, it's never rained before, why do you think it's going to rain now? What about Noah's wife? How she tried to raise her 3 sons to be faithful to God, and then encouraged them to marry women that would help them be faithful to God. What about Abraham's wife? In fact, the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 11 praises Sarah for her faith. She was 90 years old, and God says, you're going to have a baby. Excuse me? Medicare doesn't pay enough to take care of a little baby. 90 years old, and God says, you're going to have a baby. And Sarah was a woman who was of tremendous faith. She said, I don't see how that can happen, but I'll go along with it. What about Deborah and Jael? I had a lesson on Deborah not too long ago. Now, when I come to Deborah, I think we ought to understand this point, that when God chooses a woman to play a major role, now they're always playing a minor role, but when God chooses a woman to play a major role in one of these stories, it's not because she was the last thing on his list. It's because she was the right person with the right characteristics at the right time. And God says, okay, now's the time for me to use this individual. And so Deborah was a judge and she was a prophetess. And she's the one that stepped forward and said, look, men, we've got to take care of these enemies of Israel. Sisera, come on, pull up yourself by your bootstraps and let's go. And Jael, of course, Jael was the one that Sisera fled from the armies of Israel, and he hid himself in her tent. He thought surely he was in a woman's tent. She's not going to do anything harmful to him. Jael's the one that took a tent peg and drove it through his temple. Pinned him to the ground, literally. Some of these women that God's used in his plan to save man down through history. Another handful of examples from the Old Testament. Abigail. I'm going to have a special lesson on Abigail in just a couple of weeks. Because Abigail was a keen woman with a keen intellect. And she saved David from making a tremendously horrific mistake in his life. David, the story of Abigail is sandwiched in between David sparing King Saul's life. He had the opportunity in chapter 24, 1 Samuel, to kill Saul. He does not. He has the opportunity in chapter 26 to kill Saul. He does not. Chapter 25, he has every intention of going and killing Nabal. And Abigail, Nabal's wife, steps forward. She comes to David with humility, yes, but a tremendous amount of strength and courage. And she calms David down and she saves Nabal's life. We'll study more about Abigail in a couple of weeks. Tremendous example of womanhood. What about Ruth? Ruth is a great example of someone who comes outside of the nation of Israel. And she has great faith in God through, originally, her mother-in-law, Naomi. I will go where you go, and I will dwell where you dwell, and your God will be my God. You going to change religions? Yes, I'm going to change religions. I'm going to worship the God of Israel. Ruth is a good example of a woman who has a great deal of modesty and humility herself. And of course, Esther. A great example of a woman who is resourceful. A woman who has a lot of faith. When she was a queen of Persia, Persia was the world empire at that time. When she was the queen, she started off in Persia as a servant. She rises to the level of being queen. And God used Esther, not miraculously, but through Esther's own personality and her own strength. And King Ahasuerus had the practice that if you came into his throne room and you had not been summoned, then he had you killed. And so when Mordecai says to Esther, you need to go talk to the king, Esther says, I can't go to the king, I've not been summoned. And Mordecai says, you better. So Esther, as the Romanians say, Esther took her teeth in, her heart to her teeth. That's how they talk about gathering up the courage. She gathered up the courage and she went to King Ahasuerus. And she made a plea for her on behalf of her people, the Jews. And so God has used women down through the years. And God has used women in the New Testament. Think about that example that we saw there in Luke chapter 8. Jesus had a number of women that were a part of his inner circle of disciples. They're not given a prominent role, but Luke talks about them there in Luke chapter 8. Now, sometimes Luke is called, in fact, the Gospel of Women, because Luke gives a prominence to women in the life of Jesus that Matthew, Mark, and John do not. And so these women were following along with Jesus just like the men were. And the text there says, verse 3 says that these women were helping Jesus out of their own pockets. And so they were patrons of Jesus. Jesus had to eat. Jesus had to have money for various things. And these women were generous in giving Jesus out of their abundance. And they followed Jesus wherever they went. And you remember that they even followed Jesus up to Calvary. They were part of that entourage when Jesus was carrying his cross to Calvary. Some of those female disciples were there with him. And they stayed there at the cross until the very end. And they were part of that group that took his body down off the cross and laid him in the tomb. Where were all the men? They had fled, but the women were there. And then they rested on the Sabbath day as the law of Moses commanded, but then on the Lord's Day, on Sunday, on the first day of the week, the women were the first ones there in the tomb. The very first eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Christ. At that point, understanding the culture at that time helps us understand that the Bible is from God, because I'll tell you what, a woman's voice carried no weight in the court of public opinion nor in the legal system. Women could not serve as witnesses in legal courts in Rome at that time. And so for God to choose women to be the first witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus Christ goes against the cultural grain. They were there because they loved Jesus, because they followed him out of their heart, regardless of what it meant. And so the power in women is the power to build a great family and a great church. Let me talk about 4 reasons why women are great, and then we'll suggest 10 things that women do that help the family and the church. Christian women are great, number 1, because they work at making a home. We have this idiom in the United States, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. We cannot overestimate the power and the influence of mama in the home. Now, I don't believe that the reason why the educational system in the United States is as bad as it is, and you hear all the time that it's bad, especially math and science, it's not bad because we've got poor teachers. It's not bad because we've got poor technology. It's not bad because the PE teachers are poorly paid. It's not bad because we don't have all these other things in the school system. My conviction is our educational system is in the dumps because moms aren't taking education with their kids seriously at home. When you take mama out of the home and the home is no longer at the center of mama's life, then the children are going to suffer. Now, that's not to say that the woman's place is in the home. Don't misunderstand. Because the Bible places a great deal of emphasis on women working. Read Proverbs chapter 31. In Proverbs chapter 31, when Solomon talks about the virtuous woman, he even talks about the woman working outside the home. That's not the problem. The problem is not taking the woman outside the home. The problem is, in our society today, we're taking the home outside the woman. See in Proverbs chapter 31, when it talks about the woman working, rising up early and working, she's doing all of that for the benefit of her family. You see, that's the difference. In our society today, women are working outside the home because they want more. I want more. I'm doing this for me. And when the home is no longer at the center of a woman's life, then she has abdicated that the magnificent throne of power and love and influence that God has given to her. And so Christian women are great because they work at making a home.